Here we go. So we are starting off with 3 days on uh, The Prince, which you may have heard of this work before, written by a guy named Niccolo Machiavelli. You've almost certainly heard of Machiavelli or Machiavellianism at some point in your college careers, or even just in life in general. He shows up in video games, for example. He's in the Assassin's Creed video games. He shows up in movies and in TV shows and Uh, he's in Shakespeare. He's everywhere. So Machiavelli is kind of a part of the cultural lexicon, as it were. And we're going to be taking his. I mean, he really has two masterworks. On the one hand, there's The Prince, and then there's the Discourses on Livy. The Discourses on Livy are like 600 pages long, and The Prince is like 110 pages long, though. So The Prince makes a more obvious selection for undergraduates. And we're going to just go nice and slow. We're going to take this over the course of 3 days and just sort of look at what Machiavelli has to tell us. Um, just a couple things by way of background. So the Prince was composed in the 1510s, and there are a few things to note about the 1510s, or about this time period in general. So this is at the very beginning of what is often described as the Renaissance. You're probably familiar with that word. You probably took AP World History or something, and you know what the Renaissance is, the rebirth. And of course, what exactly was being rebirthed is not always clear, but for our purposes, we can just say that what was being rebirthed was the study of the classics. And it's not just the study of the classics, particularly understood as the study of the classics, as opposed to the sort of scholastic study of the Bible, but it's the study of the classics, the study of classical sources. And so we can see most clearly Machiavelli fit into this Renaissance mold with the sorts of sources that he uses and the sorts of uses that he puts them to. So if we just look at the kind of thing that counts as evidence for Machiavelli, and so we see here stories about Louis XII. We see plenty of stories about various dukes and princes from Italy and elsewhere. We see too lots of stories from Greece, stories from Rome, especially stories from Rome. Essentially lots of history. And of course, this history is going to be culled from um, classical sources, especially the Roman historians. So guys like Livy, Tacitus, Sallust, these guys show up quite a bit. So uh, he fits into the Renaissance mold nicely in that he, shows off his humanist training. He obviously has a lot of Latin. It's not totally clear whether or not he has any Greek, but he's sort of mining these classical sources for insights and for information about politics. So he's a figure in the Renaissance. He's also one of the very first figures in something that we call modern political thought, which is the title, as you probably noticed, of this course. So modern political thought begins at basically around this time. You might think like 1450 or so, and it ends with a figure like Marx, who we're going to read towards the end of the semester in 1850 or a little bit afterwards. And we see Machiavelli as a modern figure, partly because he represents so nicely some of the primary themes of modern political thought. And one of the themes of modern political thought, actually, I should say two of the themes of modern political thought that we're going to look at today, and that we'll see in other figures like Hobbes, etc., are is okay. We have two themes of modern political thought, and here's the first one. The first one is just something called realism. So you're probably familiar with the idea of realism, especially if you've taken courses in political science on international relations. But a realist, typically, we think of a realist as someone who stands in opposition to an idealist. This is a kind of fundamental theoretical tension that we observe. And so an idealist sees the world through the lens of certain ideals that they hold, and these are usually normative ideals. So, for example, usually in IR theory, when we talk about idealism, we talk about Kant and we talk about the League of Nations and we talk about the United Nations. And the basic idea is we want the world to move towards some new and better state. And in particular, we want the world to be organized along principles of something like universal justice, equality, universal human rights, something like that. So the idea is that what we would like to see is the world slowly move towards this better state. And we're going to use these ideals, things like justice, universal human rights, we're going to use these as sort of measuring sticks. And we're going to try to reform our institutions in such a way that they more closely approximate these ideals. A realist does not hold this view. So a realist thinks that, you can talk all you want to about highfalutin ideas. You can talk all you want to about morality and about natural rights and universal human rights and dignity and all this kind of stuff. And it's good that when we have those things, right? Those are things that we enjoy from time. It's better to live in a place that has respect for rights, for example, than it is to live in a place that doesn't have respect for rights. Ultimately, though, the realist thinks that there are certain like ineradicable features of human life, ineradicable features of social and political life. There's always going to be injustice. There's always going to be violence. And so for the realist, we're not trying to reform our institutions towards these ideals so much as we're trying to use our institutions to kind of minimize the damage that gets done by the sort of underlying and ineradicable violence and injustice that exists in things. So realism is itself uh, a kind of modern idea. We don't see a lot of realists or people that we would identify as realists before Machiavelli. And you can really see this contrast if you compare somebody like Machiavelli to somebody like Plato. So I hope that at some point during your time at Clemson, you read Plato, Aristotle's Politics. Plato's Republic would be probably the best work along these lines. If not, you can go to Wikipedia, take a 10-second view of Plato's Republic. You probably heard of Plato's Republic. But the idea of Plato's Republic is that if philosophers ruled, which is to say, if those who were properly guided by certain universal forms of justice, if they ruled, then we could reach a kind of, or we could approximate a kind of just city where everyone would behave in a just fashion, and our institutions would direct people towards justice. And of course, this is done through a kind of extended discussion and extended dialogue between Socrates and various friends of his, in which they construct this sort of ideal city through the course of the dialogue. And we'll see Machiavelli referencing specifically Plato's Republic, the idea of a city in the sky or a city in speech or a city in the clouds. And he wants to contrast his own approach um, with this sort of idealist approach, right? So the ancient world, they're trying to say, how do we make a city that directs us towards justice or directs us towards the good? Machiavelli's goal here in The Prince is much more modest. How do we construct a politics, or how do we construct a city that will minimize the amount of pain and violence and injustice that we have to deal with on a daily basis? So the realist, he has much more modest aims. He kind of sees the idealist as sort of off somewhere and they're sort of pie in the sky idealizing. And he's much more interested in the kind of nitty gritty of day-to-day politics and using politics to minimize suffering. The other thing that we're going to find with Machiavelli is that the way that he minimized suffering for Machiavelli is you minimize suffering partly through the inflicting of suffering. And so this is sort of where politics comes in. This is where Machiavellianism, this idea of Machiavellianism really sort of comes out. And there's one episode in particular that I want to draw your attention to. Let's see here. Okay, so in this is in chapter, so you can see the page numbers up here, and I'll see if I can, does that work? Yeah. Okay, so 26. So we're in chapter 7 of new principalities acquired with the arms of others and by fortune. And to be clear, the way he's using principalities here and the ways that he's using the prince, Machiavelli says at the very beginning of the work in chapter 1, he says that there are two types of cities. There are principalities and there are republics. And this essentially means either you are ruled by one ruler, which is what he calls a prince. It could be a king, could be a duke. It's essentially any form of autocracy. So a strong amount of political power, which is lodged in one single person, whatever their office might be. Either you're ruled by a prince and you live in a principality, or you live in a republic. And essentially, what he sets out here at the beginning of The Prince is, for the prince, I'm just going to deal with principalities. And so as we can see, like the various chapters in here, this kind of reads like a kind of advice book to princes. So for example, chapter three, no, no, chapter let's see, will be a good example. Yeah, so here's one called Of New Principalities Acquired by One's Own Troops and Virtues. So essentially, he's saying if you're a prince and you have a new principality, which is to say you have a new region under your control, and you acquire it by your own military strength, there is a different way that you ought to rule that based on how you acquired that than if you had simply inherited it, or if it had previously been a republic, or if it had previously, been lost in war or something like that. So essentially, what the Prince is it's a kind of how-to manual given to, in this case, this is was given to the Medicis, who had recently come into possession of the city of Florence, which is where he's from. And he's essentially saying, listen, I've acquired a certain amount of wisdom over the years. He was both a diplomat on the one hand and a historian. So he'd spent his entire life either working in politics or studying politics. I've acquired a lifetime of wisdom, and here's what I can tell you about how to run a principality well. And so here he's talking, this is chapter 7, of new principalities acquired with the arms of others and by fortune. So, in other words, if you get a principality and it's essentially given to you, so for example, say your father was the Pope or something like that, and actually that's the guy he's going to be talking about here, Cesare Borgia, that's essentially what the case is. Say whether the father was the Pope or he was a more powerful king somewhere else, or say you just sort of lucked into things. How should you govern it? And I want to draw your attention to an example that he gives. And this is the example of a guy named Cesare Borgia. So here's his name here, Cesare Borgia. So the funny thing about Cesare Borgia is that so when Machiavelli is writing in the 1510s, Cesare Borgia was, he was alive in people's minds. He was essentially a contemporary of Machiavelli. So everyone would have known who he was. And the thing about Borgia is that he was not known as a particularly kind man. In fact, he was known as a sort of brutal prince, a prince who used power to simply enrich himself and to acquire more power, and who was more than willing to use violence to get what he needed. Here's an example, actually, of Machiavelli's relating of Borgia's uses of power. Wait, that's not what I want. This is what I want. So Borgia, who's described here as the Duke, this is an episode in Borgia's life. Sorry, and we'll read it. As a result, the Duke decided to depend no longer upon the troops and fortune of others. His first step was to weaken the Orsini and Colonia factions in Rome. He won over all their followers, who were noblemen, making them his own noblemen and giving them huge subsidies. And he honored them according to their rank with military commands and civil appointments. As a result, in a few months, the affection for their factions was wiped out from their hearts, and all of this affection turned towards the Duke. After this, he waited for the opportunity to wipe out the Orsini leaders, having already put to flight those of Colonia family. A good opportunity arose, and the use he put to it was even better. For when the Orsini realized only too late that the greatness of the Duke and of the Church spelled their ruin, they called a meeting at Magione in the territory of Perugia. From this resulted the rebellion of Urbino, the insurrections in the Romagna, and the countless dangers for the Duke, all of which he overcame with the assistance of the French. And when his reputation had been regained, placing no trust either in France or in other forces not his own, in order not to have to test their strength, he turned to treacherous deception. He knew how to dissimulate his intentions so well that the Orsini themselves, through Lord Paolo, reconciled themselves with him. The Duke did not fail to employ every kind of gracious act to assure Paolo, giving him money, garments, and horses, so that the stupidity of the Orsini brought them to Sinigalia and into his clutches. So essentially, he's dealing with a set of nobles who are opposed to his power. They're the previous power holders in this particular region. And so after, deciding that he can't take them in a kind of full frontal assault, he decides to use deception, and he gets into their good graces and then just sort of kills them one by one. In fact, he says here that he wipes out their leaders. But here the story gets very interesting. Having wiped out these leaders and having reduced their partisans to his allies, the Duke had laid very good foundations for his power, possessing all of the Romagna along with the Duchy of Urbinum. More important, it appeared that he had befriended the Romagna and had won the support of all its populace once the people began to taste the beneficial results of his rule. Because this matter is worth noting and being imitated by others, I do not want to pass over. So, in other words, he's about to introduce a new episode that's going to be very important. And note the way that he phrases this here. The matter is worth noting and being imitated by others. This is how Machiavelli operates. This is the whole idea. You're a prince, and the way that a prince can learn how to conduct the business of being a prince is by studying the great examples of the past, seeing what other great rulers have done and imitating it. In particular, paying attention not just to what they did, but when they did it and how they did it, and emulating their style. Okay, so here's the episode. After the Duke had taken the Romagna, so the Romagna is just a region that he didn't previously hold, but that he came into possession of. After the Duke had taken the Romagna and found it governed by powerless rulers, more anxious to plunder their subjects than to correct them, and who had given them reason for disunity rather than unity, so that the entire territory was full of thefts, quarrels, and every other kind of insolence. Right, so this is important. He shows up in the Romagna. It's not that the Romagna doesn't have any rulers, it's that it has bad rulers. It has bad governors. And what makes them bad? What makes them bad is that they are more anxious, he says, to plunder their subjects than to correct them. Oh, God, stop. Here. Okay. Oh, forget it. More anxious to plunder their subjects than to correct them. So these are just weak and ineffectual rulers, and rulers who only rule so as to enrich themselves. So something that often gets kind of thrown about is that what Machiavelli recommends, or what Machiavellianism is just the use of power to your own ends. And that is just not the case. These guys are clearly using power to their own ends, and Machiavelli calls them weak and powerless rulers. And he's glad when Borgia shows up and gets rid of them. So it's not just that this territory is very poorly governed. It's that this territory isn't a very nice place to live. The entire territory was full of thefts, quarrels, and every other kind of insolence. So in other words, the Romagna was beset by a kind of violence, chronic violence. Crime was up, and nobody wants to live somewhere that crime is up. He decided that if he wanted to make the region peaceful and obedient to his regal power, it would be necessary to give it good government. Therefore, he gave a cruel and unscrupulous man, Messer Ramiro d'Orco. So he hires this guy, Messer Ramiro d'Orco. Machiavelli notes that this guy is a cruel and unscrupulous man. Borgia knows that he's cruel and unscrupulous. He hires this guy and he gives him the fullest authority there. And so he hires a cruel and unscrupulous man, a guy who he knows is cruel and unscrupulous, and he gives him full political authority in the region. In no time at all, Ramiro reduced the territory to a peaceful and united state, and in so doing, the Duke greatly increased his prestige. So he basically hires a strong man, right? He hires someone to come in and straighten things out. And typically, the way that a cruel and unscrupulous man, the only way that such a person knows how to straighten things out is through the use of violence, right? So if you have too many thefts, quarrels, and every other kind of insolence, if you got murders and rapes happening in a region, you come in and you say, listen, anyone I even suspect of murdering or raping, no trial, no nothing. I just kill you. That's it. Right. And so you can come in and use fear, which is the only kind of tool that a guy like this has at his disposal. You can come in and use fear to establish rule very quickly. Not really establish rule. You can come in and establish nonviolence very quickly. In no time at all, Ramiro reduced the territory to a peaceful and united state, and in so doing, the Duke greatly increased his prestige. Afterwards, the Duke judged that such excessive authority was no longer required, since he feared that it might become odious. And in the middle of the territory, he set up a civil tribunal with a very distinguished president, in which each city had its own advocate. Because he realized that the rigorous measures of the past had generated a certain amount of hatred, in order to purge the minds of the people and to win them completely over to his side, he wanted to show that if any form of cruelty had occurred, it did not originate from him, but from the violent nature of his minister. So this is Machiavellianism in action. He knows that some excessive amount of authority, some excessive amount of violence is necessary. And so who does he have do it? He has someone else do it. And in particular, he gets a cruel and unscrupulous man, Messer Ramiro Dorco. He has him do it. And then as soon as it's established that the violence has been reduced, as soon as everyone is kind of too afraid to commit disorderly acts, then he comes in, right? Borgia comes in, and he acts like he had nothing to do with it. I had no idea Dorco was going to behave like this. I had no idea that he was going to be as cruel and unscrupulous as he turned out to be. And so what does he do to get the people back on his side? He sets up this tribunal, which is to say, he sets up essentially a kind of court. And he puts Messer Ramiro Dorco to court. He has every village send its own advocate, which is to say, everyone gets to have some say in this court proceeding. And they put him on trial. And how does the trial end? It ends this way. Having found the occasion to do so, one morning at Cesena, he had Messer Ramiro's body laid out in two pieces on the piazza, with a block of wood and a bloody sword beside it. The ferocity of such a spectacle left that population satisfied and stupefied at the same time. So when we say that he had his body laid out in two pieces on the piazza, it means he cut him in half. He cut this guy in half. He leaves his body in the public square for everyone to see, and he leaves the bloody sword beside it. So what does this act mean? Again, think about what he's accomplished. So he comes in, it's a violent place. He knows that some excessive amount of violence is going to be necessary in order to get it back in line. That's a heavy cost to pay. You know you're going to have to do some bad things. But he has someone else do it, right? He has a bad guy come in and do it. And then when everyone gets mad about it, he steps back and says, I had no idea. I had no idea this guy was going to behave this way. I didn't tell him to do any of this kind of stuff. And notice what else he does. The people are angry. He says the people need to vent. They have to purge their hatred for this guy, right? There's a sense in which like hatred and a certain amount of resentment gets built up in a population. In a lot of ways, America, we've been experiencing the last thing for the last 10, 15 years, right? A lot of populist anger gets built up, and that has to have somewhere to vent. So he uses this court case as an opportunity for them to vent this, right? They get to send their own advocate. They get to have their say. And in the end, this guy who they all hated, this guy who they all saw as, the cause of all this fear and anxiety they were feeling, he gets cut in half. So they vent like this anger and resentment. And who comes out smelling like roses? Well, Borgia comes out smelling like roses. Why? Because in the end, he says, I had no idea this was happening. I'm on your side. And not only am I on your side, but I'm so powerful and I'm so benevolent that this thing that you hate, this big scary thing, Dorco, I'm powerful enough and I'm benevolent enough that I'm just going to cut this guy in half. And I'll leave his body in the square and you can look at it. The bloody sword, leaving the bloody sword behind, symbolizes that the violence is over. And this, he says, it's left the population satisfied and stupefied. It's what they wanted, but it demonstrates how powerful he is by the fact that he did it, and he did it in such a violent fashion. So it shows the people that he's on their side, right? That he is their protector. He might be a bad guy, but he's their bad guy. And think about the message that it sends to the nobles too, the nobles in Romagna and the nobles in these other regions that he's conquered. Messer Ramiro Dorco, by virtue of the fact that he has Messer in front of his name like that, he was a noble. This guy probably had land. And this sends the message to the rest of the nobles. It says, listen, you might have land, you might have titles, you might even work for me in some ways, but never forget that I am more than willing to literally cut you in half and leave your body for people to gawk at. So this is a really good example, in other words, of how violence can be used in a beneficent way, right? Politics, as we'll see as we work through this text, politics is a place where, violence is how it works, right? Violence is the order of the day. If you want to get by in politics, you got to know how to use violence. You got to know how to use deception. We'll talk about that more as we move through the text. And this is a really good example of how violence and deception can be used to your benefit. And of course, again, holding up Borgia, a very controversial figure, right? Regarded as a pretty maleficent prince. And here he's saying, listen, Borgia did some bad stuff. Borgia did bad things in the Romagna. There was the episode with Ramiro Dorco, et cetera, et cetera. But here he's saying, listen, sometimes you got to do bad things. Sometimes in politics, you have to be willing to conduct yourselves in apparently immoral ways in order to accomplish moral ends. Because look, at the end of the day, it's not just that Borgia was able to rule, in other words, not just that he was able to consolidate political power. The fact is that he gave the people what they needed, which is good government. Their territory when he arrived was, as he writes, full of thefts, quarrels, and every other kind of insolence. It was a bad place to live. And by the time he gets done, it's a good place to live. And the only person who really had to suffer for it was Dorco, who wasn't that great of a guy anyway. All right, I'm going to wrap it up there. I really hope this recorded and that I can make something of this recording. Please do consult the question set and submit those at some point today. And we'll see you back here tomorrow morning for another round of political theory with Machiavelli.